Hey guys, tonight we step into a room that smells like warm clay, lamp oil and dust that has been sleeping longer than most empires. You are crouched close to a low table where a scribe's reed stylus taps in small patient clicks, and every click leaves a wedge-shaped mark that might outlive the city outside. Ancient Sumerian records are like that. They look humble, even boring, and then they suddenly feel like a locked drawer you were never meant to open. Some parts of what we'll talk about are widely accepted history, grounded in archaeology and everyday evidence. Some parts are interpretation, where a careful reading might suggest more than the clay can strictly guarantee, and some parts are calm what-if imagination. Because sometimes the most honest way to approach a mystery is to admit you are not proving anything tonight, you are following clues. You probably won't survive this in the heroic sense, not because it's scary, but because you are about to face the true ancient enemy paperwork. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with where you're listening from and your local time, because it is genuinely soothing to imagine this story travelling quietly across bedrooms and couches and late-night kitchens. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You keep your shoulders loose as you step into a city that is very much alive. The air is warm, the ground is hard-packed, and the streets carry a mix of grain dust, baked bread, and the faint tang of river water. Most historians agree that the earliest Sumerian tablets we have are not dramatic prophecies at all. They are administrative records, lists of grain, lists of sheep, deliveries of beer, rations for workers. The evidence we do have points to a society learning how to manage itself at scale, using writing as a tool for counting, tracking, and deciding who gets what. And yet, the moment you hold that idea in your mind, you feel the tug of another possibility. One interpretation is that a civilization's most ordinary documents can accidentally preserve its deepest anxieties, not because the scribe meant to be poetic, but because even a list can reveal what a city fears losing. You look at the clay while it is still damp, and you imagine the person who pressed those wedges into it. Their fingers are steady. Their wrist has the calm of practice. Their job is not to entertain you. Their job is to make the world legible. It is easy in a quiet, modern room to picture writing as art first. In early Mesopotamia, writing is also a technology for survival. Archaeology suggests that as cities grow, they need systems to distribute food, organize labor, and enforce agreements. Clay is everywhere, so clay becomes the notebook of the river plains. And when you think about it, clay has a certain stubborn honesty. Paper burns. Papyrus rots, clay bakes hard. When a building catches fire, which is a grim little joke of preservation, the city panics, the archive survives. History has a strange sense of timing, like it is always late to the party, but somehow still brings snacks. You wander past a temple complex, not as a tourist, but as someone trying to be invisible. There is an economy here, and it moves through storerooms, courtyards, and scribal rooms where tablets are stacked like small brown loaves. Most historians agree that temples in Sumer are not just spiritual centres. They are major institutions that organise land labour and distribution. The evidence we do have points to a temple economy where offerings and rations flow in a managed loop. A scribe sits with the stylus and makes that loop visible. Now comes the quiet turn, the one you hold gently so it does not snap into certainty. A careful reading might suggest that in a world run by distribution, control over records is control over reality. If your name is on the tablet, you exist as a worker, a recipient, a debtor, a witness. If your name is missing, you're either free in a way the system cannot touch, or you are simply not counted, which is a different kind of danger. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that writing does not just describe power. Writing becomes part of power. And in that background hum of administration, the word Anunnaki begins to float into view, not as a flashing neon sign, but as a term that changes shape depending on who is speaking and when. What's broadly accepted is that Anunnaki refers to a group of deities in Mesopotamian tradition with roles that shift across time and cities. The evidence we do have points to a religious landscape that is not one tidy chart, but an evolving conversation. Gods merge, split, gain titles, lose titles. The divine world, like the human one, has politics. One interpretation is that when later readers see a single term like Anunnaki, they want it to behave like a single fixed category. But the ancient world is rarely that neat. There's no full consensus on how to map every use of the term across centuries. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were consistently framed as underworld judges, high gods, ancestral powers, or simply a flexible divine group labelled that different communities used in different ways. That debate matters because the way you translate a word changes the story you think you are reading. So you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, you are standing in early cities, where writing emerges as a practical tool and myths and rituals evolve alongside it. On the misty side, you notice how human minds work. We see a word like descent or coming down, and we imagine an arrival. We see departure or withdrawal, and we imagine an ending. But ancient language is often ritual language, and ritual language likes to loop and shimmer. Now you let the theory enter the room in a calm monetization safe way. A fringe idea proposes that certain ancient stories about gods descending are not about arrival at all, but about escape. As if the divine figures are not conquerors landing in triumph, but survivors slipping out of danger. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers in popular imagination because it flips the emotional angle. Instead of they came to rule, it becomes they left to survive. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask a softer question. What if the story is pointing at something else? To be clear, this is debated and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Most mainstream scholarship does not interpret Sumerian records as literal accounts of extraterrestrial beings. The more cautious explanation could be that descent language reflects ritual kingship ideology and the way humans imagine authority coming from above, sanctioned by the sky. but human storytelling also preserves emotional truths in symbolic form. It's possible that some myths carry memories of upheaval, migration, or elite displacement coded into divine drama. You walk toward a small scribal space, the kind that is part office, part classroom, part archive. A boy or young man sits with his tongue slightly out, concentrating, because apparently that is a human expression older than agriculture. He presses wedges into clay copying signs again and again. Most historians agree that scribes trained through repetition learning sign forms lists and standard phrases. The evidence we do have points to scribal education as a long disciplined process, and the scribes become essential to administration law and temple life. Here is your first small joke for the night, because you can feel yourself taking it too seriously. You watch the student copy sign after sign, and you realise the oldest known job security plan might be invent a writing system so complicated everyone needs you forever. You smile quietly and keep walking. On the mainstream side, you notice how the tablets are stored. Some are small and personal, others larger and more official. Some are sealed, which matters. Seals, the little cylinder carvings rolled over wet clay, are widely accepted as markers of identity and authority. Archaeology suggests seals function like signatures, and security tying a person or institution to a transaction. This is the world's earliest please sign here, except it is also art, because humans cannot resist making even bureaucracy beautiful. And now the cinematic possibility kept gentle. What if a sealed tablet is not just about preventing tampering, but about preserving a message for a time when the sender is no longer present to explain it? You are not claiming that is what happened. You are letting your imagination breathe in the quiet. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You pick up a tablet in your mind, careful, like it is still damp. It is not a prophecy. It is a list. Grain issued to workers. Beer allotted for a festival day. A record of goats moved from one pen to another. Most historians agree that these are the kinds of texts that dominate early archives. They are the heartbeat of daily life. And yet, what if a city's daily life is exactly where you would hide a panic? Because daily life is where nobody looks for drama. A careful reading might suggest that the most dangerous secret is one that can pass as routine. Your second light joke slips in here because the thought is heavy. You picture an ancient official reading a tablet and sighing in exhaustion, and you think with sudden kinship that the oldest human emotion might be, I can't believe I have to file this. You feel your modern shoulders relax. The past is foreign, but it is not alien. So you return to the night's central mood, not as a claim, but as a question. Ancient Sumerian records might hint to some listeners that the Anunnaki did not arrive so much as escape. Most archaeologists would caution that myths are not straightforward chronicles. Most historians agree that deities in texts serve religious and political functions, and still interpretation has room to ask why certain patterns repeat, why descent and withdrawal appear, Why divine assemblies argue why kingship is framed as granted, revoked, restored. Let me rephrase that more carefully, because your sleepy brain deserves careful language. We are not saying a tablet proves anything about cosmic refugees. We are saying that when you read ancient words with modern curiosity, you might notice how easily arrival stories can be read as leaving stories, especially if you are already primed to look for exits. That's a possibility, not a certainty. It is a lens, not a verdict. You let the lamp smoke curl upward. You listen to the soft scratch of the stylus. You imagine the tablet drying, then baking, then sleeping through centuries of collapse, flood rebuild, and forgetting. The evidence we do have points to a world that loved lists and rituals, and that world becomes the foundation for later civilizations. And in the quiet space between wedges, you allow one last what if to hover like dust in lamplight. What if the most powerful beings in the story are not the ones who arrive, but the ones who vanish, leaving only paperwork and myths behind? Your third small joke arrives like a pillow fluff. If ancient gods did escape, you can only hope they filed the correct forms before leaving, because otherwise some poor scribe is still waiting for their missing signature 4,000 years later, tapping his stylus and muttering very calmly, "Please return to the temple office during normal hours." You breathe out, the clay, the lamp, the city noise fading into night. You keep walking deeper into the living maze of records, where the next tablet is always waiting and where every ordinary detail might carry a faint shadow of a larger story. You drift along a street that feels older than your sense of time. The road is packed earth, not romantic, not polite, and the footprints in it are layered like gossip. To your left, a wall of mud brick holds the day's warmth, and to your right, a donkey stares at you with the calm judgment of an animal that has seen too many human plans collapse. Somewhere nearby, someone is roasting barley, and the smell is warm and toasted like a kitchen trying its best. Most historians agree that one of the great turning points in early Mesopotamia is not a war or a coronation, but the simple fact of cities getting big. Archaeology suggests that places like Uruk grew into dense urban centres with temples, workshops, neighbourhoods, and a constant flow of goods and people. The evidence we do have points to specialisation, organised labour and systems that can coordinate thousands of lives without everyone having to personally know everyone else. And when you think about it in modern terms, you realise you are watching the invention of something you know very well. Not the wheel, not the plough, not even writing in the abstract. You are watching the invention of the form you forgot to sign. You pass a courtyard where workers are carrying baskets, and you can almost feel the math of it in the air. How many baskets? How much grain? How many days? Who received what? Who owes what? Most historians agree that early writing develops in this administrative context, and that is why the earliest tablets are so often lists, tallies, and receipts. A city at Uruk scale needs a memory that is stronger than rumour and longer than a shouted order. Now your mind takes the careful step from documented ground into interpretation gently, like you are stepping from dry stone into shallow water. One interpretation is that order itself becomes a kind of civic spell. Not magic in the sparkly sense, but magic in the practical sense, where symbols and routines shape reality. When everyone agrees that a mark on clay means 10 measures of barley, that agreement becomes a social power. A careful reading might suggest that the city's true walls are not just mud brick, but shared systems, shared signs, shared expectations. You pause at a small stall where someone is measuring out something grainy into a container, and your sleepy brain offers its first joke of the night on a silver spoon. You watch the measuring and the checking and the counting, and you think with affectionate disbelief that the first big city might have been powered by 2 fuels barley and mild irritation. A man is always waiting for someone else to bring the right amount, and history, it turns out, is often the story of missing inventory. Still, the mainstream anchors hold steady. Archaeology suggests that Uruk's growth involves not just people, but infrastructure. Canals, roads, storage spaces, and temple compounds that manage surplus. The evidence we do have points to temple institutions playing a major role in organising production and distribution, and to officials and scribes keeping track. This is not a fantasy kingdom. It is a working city humming with logistics. And yet, as you walk past a scribal room, you notice the stacks, tablets in piles, tablets in baskets, tablets resting on shelves. There's a particular smell here, damp clay and drying clay, and the faint smoke of lamps. It smells like a library, but also like a workshop, because knowledge is being made, not merely stored. Here comes the cinematic possibility kept softly labelled as what if. What if those stacks are not merely the record of abundance, but a kind of emergency ration for memory, not grain, not beer, but proof. Proof of belonging, proof of entitlements, proof that a person exists within the system. If a crisis comes, a tablet can be a lifeline. If you can point to your name, to your ration allotment, to your assigned work, you can argue for your portion of survival. In that sense, tally marks are not just accounting. They are a kind of permission slip to keep breathing. This is not a claim that scribes intended it as a disaster plan. The more cautious explanation could be that records are simply necessary for managing complex economies. Still, it is possible that in a world where food distribution is organised, records take on a protective role. And what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the obsession with documentation is partly a response to instability, a quiet fear that the world can shift overnight, and you will need proof that you belong to yesterday? Most historians agree that Uruk's cultural influence spreads widely, and that symbols and styles from Uruk appear across regions in what scholars often call an expansion of ideas and administrative techniques. Archaeology suggests that this is not a single simple story, and that different communities adopt and adapt what they find useful. The evidence we do have points to a gradual spread of practices, not necessarily an empire marching with banners, but a pattern of influence. Historians still argue whether Uruk's expansion reflects colonization trade networks, elite migration, or a more diffuse cultural process. where local groups take on Uruk-style tools because they work. That debate matters because it shapes how you imagine people moving. It shapes whether you picture conquest-imitation partnership or something messier and more human. You keep moving and the city keeps offering small grounded details. You see pottery drying in the sun. You hear the slap of wet clay being shaped. You catch a glimpse of a seal being rolled on a lump of clay, leaving a crisp image, a tiny declaration that says, in the most ancient bureaucratic language imaginable, yes, this is official. And now the mystery theory portion still tethered to safety. A fringe idea proposes that when later traditions describe powerful beings interacting with early cities, we are seeing echoes of something literal, perhaps outsiders with advanced knowledge, perhaps a class of elites remembered as divine. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because early cities can feel like sudden leaps in complexity. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can use it as a storytelling lens instead of a claim. In that lens, the phrase "they arrived" can be questioned, because if you picture a group arriving, you picture a beginning. But if you picture escaping, you picture urgency, you picture secrecy, you picture careful systems that hide movement inside routine. And here in Uruk, routine is everything. Grain moves, labour moves, goods move. The city is movement. What if an escape, if it happened, would look like administration? What if you could vanish by travelling in plain sight, hidden inside the river of legitimate commerce? Let me rephrase that more carefully so it stays honest. We are not saying Uruk's tablets document a cosmic evacuation. We are saying that the sheer scale of record keeping can feel to an imaginative reader like a society trying to hold itself together against something it cannot fully control. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You pass a line of workers and you notice their pace. Not frantic, not leisurely, but steady. There is a rhythm to city life, and it has the same cadence as a stylus tapping clay. Tap, tap, tap. You think of all the small decisions that have to be made for a city to function, and your second joke arrives friendly and sleepy. You realise that the first megacity probably invents the first unofficial sport standing around, while someone in charge decides what to do. The event begins at dawn and lasts all day. The daylight shifts. Dust hangs in the air. A child runs past holding something, maybe bread, maybe a piece of clay, maybe a treasure only a child can name. You keep your gaze soft, taking in the details without grabbing them too hard. Most historians agree that early urban life includes social layers, from elites and priests to craftsmen, labourers, and farmers supporting the city from surrounding fields. The evidence we do have points to a structured society with institutions that can mobilise large projects. Archaeology suggests that this is how monumental building, canal maintenance and temple management become possible. In other words, cities do not run on inspiration, they run on coordination. That is where your interpretation angle deepens. One interpretation is that coordination itself becomes sacred. Not because people worship spreadsheets, though give humanity time, and it might happen, but because the ability to organise surplus labour and ritual creates stability, and stability feels like divine favour. A careful reading might suggest that order is a spiritual value in a land where rivers can flood and harvests can fail. When order is threatened, myths speak. When order is restored, kings boast. When order must be remembered, scribes write. And now, your third light joke, because the mind needs a soft cushion. You imagine a high official in Uruk looking over a pile of tablets and sighing in a very modern way, thinking, I did not choose the clay life chose me. You almost laugh out loud, but you keep it inside like a secret snack. You wander toward the edge of a storage area and you picture the stacks again, not just as records, but as a city's mirrored self. Every tablet is a reflection of a real action. Someone delivered, someone received, someone promised. And what if the deeper story, the one that some listeners love to imagine, is not that gods thunder into the city, but that something powerful slips away from it, leaving behind a trail of paperwork as the only footprints? You do not force an answer. You let the question sit like a tablet drying in the shade. You stay on the solid ground of what's broadly accepted, and you allow the mist of possibility to drift along the edges, never swallowing the street. The city keeps moving. The scribes keep tapping. And you keep walking calm and curious, as if the next corner might hold a new clue hiding in plain sight. You ease closer to the temple district, where the air changes not dramatically, but unmistakably, like you've stepped into a place that expects you to lower your voice. The street noise thins. Footsteps soften. Even the donkeys seem to consider their life choices. Ahead of you, the ziggurat rises in layered terraces. A mountain made by hands, its mud brick steps catching the last warmth of the day. It looks sturdy, patient, and frankly a little judgmental, like architecture that has never once apologized. Most historians agree that ziggurats and temple complexes function as religious centers and also as economic hubs. Archaeology suggests that temples manage land storage, labour and redistribution, and that these institutions shape the rhythm of city life. The evidence we do have points to temples being places where rituals happen. Yes, but also where grain is stored, where workers are assigned, where offerings are counted, and where authority is made visible in brick and ceremony. You stand at the base and let your eyes travel upward. The top is not simply a roof, it is an idea. One interpretation is that height matters because it makes power feel close to the sky, and close to the sky means close to legitimacy. A careful reading might suggest that the ziggurat is less a ladder for gods and more a billboard for humans, a way of saying, look how organised we are. Look how much surplus we can marshal. Look how high we can build without it all collapsing into a sad pile of mud. Still, when you tilt your head back, you can't help the cinematic thought arriving softly as a question. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the stairways are not only symbolic but practical in ways we can't fully confirm? Not in a science fiction sense that pretends to be fact, but in a human sense where architecture serves multiple purposes. It's possible that ziggurats include storerooms, offices, and controlled spaces. A more cautious explanation could be that temples need secure areas for valuables and administrative work. But what if in moments of crisis those secure areas become staging points, places where the most important items are gathered, sealed and protected? You move through a courtyard and notice the choreography. People carry baskets, others stand and wait. Someone is checking something with the intense focus of a person who is about to catch a thief, or a person who's about to catch a math mistake. You realise the temple economy is a giant breathing machine, inhaling offerings, exhaling rations, and keeping the city's social order humming. And because you are human, and because your mind likes little jokes, even when it is sleepy, you think the ziggurat is basically the ancient version of a corporate headquarters, except with more incense and fewer motivational posters. First light joke delivered gently. You can almost picture a sign carved into clay somewhere that says, "Please submit all offerings to the correct department." Most historians agree that temples are staffed by priests, administrators and workers, and that religion and economy are tightly woven. The evidence we do have points to rituals being embedded in daily life, with festivals, offerings and divine patronage shaping identity. Archaeology suggests that material culture, including statues, altars and votive objects, plays a role in how communities relate to their gods. Now you let interpretation drift in, careful and honest. One interpretation is that when a society ties its economic system to divine authority, it becomes harder to challenge. If the temple controls grain and labour, and the temple is also the house of the god, then questioning the system can feel like questioning the cosmos. A careful reading might suggest that this makes stability more likely, but it can also make change more dangerous. Systems that become sacred do not like to be revised. At the same time, you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You're not claiming temples are sinister. You are describing how institutions work, and institutions, like human beings, can be comforting and controlling at once. You glance at the ziggurat again, and you notice doors sealed, spaces boundaries. The presence of seals and controlled access feels important. Archaeology suggests that cylinder seals and ceilings are used to secure storerooms and containers and to authenticate transactions. The evidence we do have points to a world where trust is partly personal but increasingly procedural. You do not just say "I promise." You impress a symbol. You leave a mark that others recognise. This is where the mystery theory portion can slip in without pretending to be certainty. A fringe idea proposes that some ziggurats are not only religious platforms, but also repositories of special knowledge, perhaps guarded traditions, perhaps technical practices, remembered later as divine gifts. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals to modern minds because we like the idea of a secret room at the top of the world. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can explore what it would mean in story terms without claiming it happened. What if the sealed rooms hold not treasure, but instructions, not alien manuals, because we'll keep our feet on the ground, but plans, schedules, lists of names? The kind of information that matters if an elite group needs to coordinate movement. You're not proving anything tonight, you are following clues. And the clue in this case is the combination of height control and record keeping. These are the ingredients of authority. They could also be the ingredients of an orderly exit. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that the architecture and administration we see are simply what you get when a city becomes complex. That is the mainstream view, and it is strong. But one interpretation is that complexity also creates opportunities for hiding. In a small village, everyone notices everything. In a city, you can move important goods under official seal and it looks like routine. In a temple economy, sealed baskets move all the time. What if the story is pointing at something else? And escape is simply a modern way of describing elite relocation hidden inside bureaucracy. Historians still argue whether Ziggurats were primarily symbolic monuments, practical administrative centres, or a blend that varies by city and period. And that debate shapes how you imagine what happens behind the walls. There's no full consensus on how uniform these structures are because time changes them. Cities rebuild and evidence is uneven. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You climb a few steps, not all the way, because you are not trying to get struck by lightning in a bedtime story. The mud brick under your feet feels rough. You can see the city spreading out behind you, low rooftops and narrow lanes, smoke rising from cooking fires. From here, the ziggurat does what it is designed to do. It changes your perspective. It makes the city feel ordered. It makes the temple feel central. It makes authority feel natural like gravity. Second light joke, because you're still you. You imagine a tired worker looking up at this massive structure and thinking, yes, yes, beautiful, but can we please build a ramp next time you smile? The past becomes less distant when you remember that complaining is also a timeless human craft. You step back down into the courtyard and focus on the human scale again. People are moving goods. Others are recording. Someone is counting with their fingers, and you realise counting is older than writing, and writing is just counting that refuses to be forgotten. Most historians agree that temple offerings include food, animals, textiles, and crafted items, and that the temple redistributes resources to workers and dependents. Archaeology suggests that storage facilities and administrative tablets reflect these flows. The evidence we do have points to an economy where the temple's strength is partly its ability to collect surplus and deploy it. Now the cinematic possibility arrives like a shadow passing over sunlight, brief and gentle. What if in a time of threat, a temple becomes a place where the most valuable thing is not gold or gems, but people? Skilled scribes, administrators, ritual specialists, the kind of people whose knowledge keeps the system alive. If a powerful group needed to leave, even temporarily, they might gather the people who know how to rebuild order elsewhere. They might seal up supplies. They might store records, and later, when stories are told, the departure might be recast as the gods withdrawing, leaving the city bereft. To be clear, this is debated and we're not claiming it as history. A more cautious explanation could be that myths of divine withdrawal reflect human experiences of loss, famine, political change, or the natural cycles of ritual. But it's possible that symbolic language carries a memory of real disruptions. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Third light joke, soft as a yawn. If the gods did escape you, imagine they didn't sprint dramatically out the front gate. They probably left through the administrative exit carrying a sealed bundle labelled miscellaneous, because nothing says power like being able to classify your secrets as your office supplies. You let the temple district fade into evening. The ziggurat remains layered and quiet, not answering your questions, only inviting them. You keep walking, carrying the smell of clay and lamp smoke with you as if it has settled into your clothes. And in the space between mainstream history and misty possibility, you allow one last thought to rest. Ziggurats may be stairways to the divine in symbolism, and they may be warehouses of daily life in practice. But what if in the most human way they are also reminders that civilization builds upward when it wants to be seen, and it builds inward when it wants to protect what it cannot explain? You step away from the temple's shadow and into a quieter lane, where the city's noise becomes more scattered, like someone has turned down the volume on the world. The air cools a little, you smell damp earth and old brick, and somewhere a pot is boiling with a gentle persistent blurp that sounds like the ancient version of a podcast you never asked for but are now weirdly invested in. In a small room off the lane, you find what feels like the city's memory closet. Not dramatic, not glowing, just shelves and baskets and stacks of clay tablets, some worn smooth at the edges from handling. Most historians agree that many ancient texts survive because clay, once fired or baked, can endure for thousands of years. Archaeology suggests that archives often contain administrative records alongside legal texts and literary works, and that the mix reflects the city's needs and values. The evidence we do have points to writing becoming a tool that serves both the practical and the ceremonial. You pick up a tablet in your mind and imagine its weight, that compact heaviness that says, "I am not going anywhere." A king's list might be nearby, a god list, a set of names and reign lengths and titles arranged like a carefully combed story. What's broadly accepted is that such lists exist and were used in different contexts, sometimes copying older material, sometimes shaping it. The evidence we do have points to the fact that ancient people, like modern people, loved a good list, especially when it made the world feel orderly. Now your interpretation angle arrives with its soft signpost. One interpretation is that lists are not neutral. They are curated. They choose what counts. They choose where the story begins, where it pauses, where it smooths over the awkward parts. A careful reading might suggest that a king's list is as much about legitimacy as it is about memory. It can say, "These are the rightful rulers," and by saying it, it can help make it so. In a world where power is fragile, a tidy sequence can be a form of armour. You notice something else too. Lists create continuity. They stitch together gaps. They make centuries feel like a single line. And that is where your cinematic what-if mood can breathe gently, What if the smoothing is not only about pride but also about concealment? Not in a conspiracy way you have to swear to, but in the quiet human way where people prefer a clean story over a messy one. If a period includes displacement collapse, or an elite group leaving the later record might compress it, reframe it, or fill it with sacred language that makes it less embarrassing and more meaningful. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not saying there is a hidden confession inside every list. We are saying that texts often reflect the priorities of the people who copy and preserve them. That's a possibility, not a certainty. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Most historians agree that divine hierarchies and pantheons in Mesopotamia shift over time, with local gods rising and falling in prominence. Archaeology suggests that political changes can influence religious emphasis, and that different cities champion their own divine patrons. The evidence we do have points to religion and politics being intertwined like two threads that keep crossing no matter how much you try to separate them. So you look at a god list with a calmer eye. One interpretation is that listing gods is also a way of listing power structures. A high god at the top reflects who is dominant culturally or politically. A rearranged pantheon can hint at shifting alliances, new dynasties, or the rise of a city. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that divine order in text sometimes mirrors human order on the ground. Now the mystery theory portion enters clearly framed as fringe. A fringe idea proposes that when some traditions speak of divine councils and ranked beings, they preserve a memory of a hierarchical group that was not purely symbolic, perhaps outsiders, perhaps an elite cadre remembered later as gods. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has staying power in popular culture because it makes the lists feel like rosters. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can be a storytelling lens, not a claim. In that lens, a king's list becomes more than a history of human rulers. It becomes a bridge between categories linking divine and human legitimacy. And here, the knight's title mood returns. What if the records hint that these beings did not arrive so much as escape? If someone left in a hurry, leaving behind systems and titles, later generations might preserve the framework, but rewrite the reasons. They might say the gods withdrew instead of the elites relocated, because withdrawal sounds sacred and relocation sounds like paperwork. Your first light joke slips in because the topic can get heavy. You picture an ancient editor staring at a messy timeline and deciding with the confidence of a modern social media manager, we are going to curate this. Then you imagine them carving the equivalent of trust me into clay. The city's greatest invention might be writing, but the second greatest might be spin. Historians still argue whether the King's List is meant as literal chronology, political propaganda, mythic structure, or a mix that changes across copies and contexts. There's no full consensus because the list is copied and adapted, and because parts of it include reign lengths that feel symbolic rather than strictly historical. The debate matters because it determines how you treat the list, as a calendar, as a manifesto, or as a myth in administrative clothing. You stay grounded. Most historians agree that some kings and dynasties can be supported by other evidence, while other portions of such lists are harder to corroborate. The evidence we do have points to a blend where historical memory and ideological storytelling share the same clay. You shift your attention to the act of copying. A scribe's job is not always to preserve every uncertainty. Often it is to produce a usable text. A careful reading might suggest that usability shapes what survives. A text that helps justify rule, organize ritual, or teach students gets copied. A text that confuses or undermines authority might fade away. This is not a grand secret. It is just how institutions behave. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now the cinematic what if arrives in a quieter voice. What if certain phrases in these lists, the way they describe power coming down, being granted, being taken away, are not only religious metaphors but also emotional fingerprints of times when leadership changed suddenly? If an old order collapses, people ask why. They may answer with theology. They may say a god turned their face away. They may say a divine council decided. In story terms, that language can also resemble an evacuation narrative, not because it is literally one, but because both kinds of stories share the same emotional shape. Before there was order, then there was loss. Later, there is a longing to explain. Second light joke, because your brain deserves one. You look at the careful rows of names and titles and think humans will literally carve an entire political argument into clay, but ask them to admit they made a mistake, and suddenly everyone is mysteriously unavailable. Even 4,000 years ago, accountability was a limited resource. You move to another shelf and imagine a text that is not a list of kings, but a legal or administrative record that uses formulaic language, because formula makes things stable. Most historians agree that legal and administrative texts often follow set patterns with names, witnesses, and seals. The evidence we do have points to a culture that values formalization, because formalization reduces disputes. Archaeology suggests that these patterns show a growing reliance on written agreements. Here is an interpretation angle that stays mainstream safe. One interpretation is that as writing becomes authoritative, it reshapes how people think. A promise is no longer just spoken, it is recorded. A boundary is no longer just remembered, it is inscribed. And that shift can make society more durable, but also more rigid. The clay does not easily forgive. Now the fringe-flavoured possibility softened and labelled. A popular rumour claims that hidden messages can be found in the gaps between official texts in recurring symbols in odd turns of phrase. This theory isn't widely accepted and it often overreaches, but it captures a real truth about archives they contain. Patterns and patterns invite interpretation. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask a gentler question. What if some scribes knowingly or not preserved hints of upheaval in the very formulas meant to suppress it? Let me rephrase that more carefully. We're not saying scribes were secret novelists leaving coded alien diaries. We are saying that repeated phrases can carry cultural memory, and cultural memory can include fear, pride, and loss. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Third light joke, soft as a blanket. You imagine the Anunnaki if they were ever anything more than divine figures in story dealing with this archive and deciding very practically we should leave a list. Because nothing says mysterious beings beyond human comprehension like labelling your boxes. You set the tablet down in your mind and let the room's quiet settle. Lists of gods, lists of kings, names pressed into clay by human hands that wanted the world to make sense. Most historians agree that these texts shape how later generations understand their past. One interpretation is that the shaping is intentional, a craft of legitimacy. And what if, in the gentle fog of imagination, the shaping also covers moments when someone important was not arriving but leaving, and the only trace they left behind was a sequence of names arranged to look like destiny instead of departure. You slip into a low building where the air is warmer than outside, trapped by mud brick and bodies and the slow heat of lamps. The floor is hard dusted with fine grit. There is a quiet intensity here that feels familiar in a way you do not expect, like walking into a classroom right before an exam. Someone coughs softly, someone whispers and gets shushed with the speed of a practiced professional, and then you hear it, the tiny scratch and tap of styluses on clay, a sound so repetitive it could hypnotize you if you let it. Most historians agree that scribal schools, often called Durba, in later tradition trained students to read and write, to copy lists, to learn standard sign forms, and to absorb the routines of administration. Archaeology suggests that learning materials included exercises, lexical lists, and copies of model texts, and that education was rigorous and often tied to institutions and elites. The evidence we do have points to literacy being a specialised skill, not a casual hobby, and to scribes becoming essential for record-keeping, law, and temple economy. You sit near the edge trying to look like you belong, which is difficult because your main qualification is that you have watched people write with tired eyes at 2 a.m. The students are bent over small tablets, practicing the same sign again and again. A teacher moves slowly behind them, posture straight, the calm authority of someone who can ruin your day with a single glance. One interpretation is that scribal education is not only about communication, it is also about shaping minds to fit the system. Repetition trains precision, copying trains obedience to form. Memorizing lists trains a student to accept categories and hierarchies. A careful reading might suggest that a society built on distribution and administration needs people who can think in standardized ways, because standardized thinking makes standardized governance possible. You watch a student press a wedge, then press it again, correcting the angle, the depth, the spacing. It is not artistic freedom, it is exactness. And here your first light joke arrives, gentle and affectionate. You realise the oldest form of content moderation might be a teacher leaning over your shoulder and saying, "No, that sign is wrong," with the same exhausted disappointment your modern brain reserves for autocorrect. The student sighs. The stylus taps. Time continues. Most historians agree that these schools likely served a narrow segment of society, and that literacy conferred status and opportunities. The evidence we do have points to scribes acting as administrators, accountants and legal specialists, often tied to temple and palace structures. Archaeology suggests that the scale of written records implies organised training because writing systems do not spread smoothly without deliberate teaching. You notice something almost tender. The students share a kind of quiet camaraderie, the way people do when they are all suffering through the same thing. A boy passes another a small lump of clay, and the gesture feels casual, like lending a pencil. The teacher does not react. Maybe this is allowed. Maybe the teacher simply does not have the energy to fight every minor rebellion. Now your interpretation angle deepens, still clearly marked as interpretation. One interpretation is that education creates a controlled pipeline of authority. If only certain people can write, only certain people can define reality on clay. The written word becomes a gate. It decides who is recorded, who is remembered, who is legally visible. A careful reading might suggest that this gatekeeping is not necessarily malicious, but it is powerful. If your world runs on tablets, the people who make tablets can shape what counts as true. Historians still argue whether Scribal schools were primarily practical training centres for administration, broader cultural institutions that preserved literature and identity, or social filters that reinforce class distinctions more than they expanded opportunity. There's no full consensus because evidence varies. School practices likely differed by city and period, and surviving texts represent what was written down, not everything that was taught. You keep your feet on mainstream ground. The evidence we do have points to students copying lexical lists, which are basically ancient word catalogues, animals, plants, professions, objects, places. Most historians agree that these lists help standardize vocabulary and signs, making communication consistent across officials and institutions. Archaeology suggests that this kind of standardization supports broader networks because it reduces confusion and disputes. Then you let the mist drift in at the edges carefully. What if a list is not only a learning tool, but also a worldview? If you learn the world as a list, you learn that everything has a slot. You learn that order is possible. You learn that order is desirable. You learn that order is protected by those who know how to write it. This is where your mystery theory portion arrives, clearly framed and gently cautious. A fringe idea proposes that within the repetitive training of scribal schools, certain phrases or copied passages might have carried special meaning beyond their surface function, almost like cultural passwords. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin, but it appeals to the modern imagination because repetition is exactly how codes survive. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask a softer question: what if some lines students copied were preserved because they felt important in a way the students could not fully explain? Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not claiming scribal schools were secret societies hiding extraterrestrial messages in homework. We are saying that education preserves tradition, and tradition can preserve hints of upheaval, fear and hope. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You watch a teacher pick up a student's tablet and hold it to the lamp. The marks catch the light. The teacher nods once, which is basically the ancient equivalent of a 5-star review. Second light joke slips in. You think of how even now the highest compliment in many workplaces is not enthusiasm, but a brief nod that says, "Fine." The student looks relieved, like he just survived a small storm. Most historians agree that over time, scribes did more than keep accounts. They copied and preserved stories, hymns and wisdom texts. The evidence we do have points to a scribal culture that becomes a major vehicle for literature memory and identity. Archaeology suggests that the survival of many myths and epics depends on scribal copying, sometimes centuries after the stories first circulated. That brings a new interpretation angle. One interpretation is that scribes are not just recorders, they are curators. They select what is worth copying. They smooth language. They standardize phrases. A careful reading might suggest that scribal tradition can gradually shift a story's emphasis, not necessarily by lying, but by clarifying in ways that reflect the needs of the present. And here is where the night's central what-if can sit quietly on the table like a small object you do not touch. If a later tradition describes divine beings descending, ruling, withdrawing, or vanishing, it is possible that the story shifts because the community's needs shift. In peaceful times, descent can sound like blessing. In anxious times, the same imagery can feel like warning. In times of displacement, withdrawal can feel like abandonment. And if you're in the mood for gentle imagination, what if they escaped is simply another emotional reading of the same symbolic vocabulary. A more cautious explanation could be that these mythic patterns reflect universal human concerns: authority, order, disaster, renewal. Most historians agree that myths are not straightforward historical reports. Archaeology suggests that deities often embody social and natural forces, and that myth language is layered. But the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. A careful reading might suggest that myths can carry memories without being chronicles. You notice something on a student's practice tablet. It is a line of copied signs that look to your modern eye almost like a chant, a repeated phrase, a repeated pattern. You do not claim it is a code. You simply notice how repetition works. It burrows into the mind. It survives sleep. It survives stress. It survives generations. If an idea needed to endure education, is one of the safest hiding places, not because it is secret, but because it is persistent. Third light joke arrives, sleepy and harmless. You imagine a student muttering under his breath, "If I have to copy this list one more time, I will become an underworld deity myself." Then you remember gently that students have always been dramatic, and the universe has always ignored them with calm indifference. You stand and let the classroom's rhythm wash over you. Tap, scratch, tap. The teacher's soft footsteps. The faint hiss of a lamp. Most historians agree that this disciplined training helped build and maintain complex institutions. One interpretation is that the discipline itself created a kind of social glue, making official culture coherent across people and years. And what if in the soft fog of imagination, that same discipline also preserved an echo of something like a farewell, not written in flashing letters but copied so many times, it became part of the world's background hum. You step out of the schoolroom and into a lane where the night air feels cooler against your skin, like the city has finally remembered you are a living creature and not a clay tablet. A lamp flickers in a doorway. Somewhere nearby, someone laughs, and the sound is brief but real, the kind of laugh that says, even in an old city, with old responsibilities, people still find reasons to grin. Now the texts in your mind begin to change texture. The lists and rations are still there, steady as footsteps, but alongside them, you begin to feel the pull of story, of myth, of words that are not only about barley and sheep, but about why the sky looks the way it does, and why power feels heavy, and why humans keep insisting the universe has a plan. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myth traditions evolve over long periods, with themes and characters shifting between Sumerian and later Akkadian language contexts. Archaeology suggests that myths were performed, recited, and copied, and that the versions we have reflect layers of transmission rather than a single original script. The evidence we do have points to continuity and change at the same time, like a melody that keeps being reharmonized. You let yourself imagine a scribe in a quiet corner copying a myth, not because it will feed workers tomorrow, but because it will feed meaning. In later periods, stories like the Enuma Elish become famous, but one interpretation is that many of its themes have older roots, including earlier Sumerian ideas about divine order, cosmic struggle, and kingship. A careful reading might suggest that myth is one of the ways societies talk to themselves about authority. When a king rules, myth can explain why. When a city rises, myth can bless it. When life feels unstable, myth can offer a frame that says, yes, this chaos has a shape. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. What's broadly accepted is that these myths are not newspaper reports. They are symbolic narratives often tied to ritual contexts, sometimes to political legitimacy. A more cautious explanation could be that gods represent forces, institutions, and ideals, and that divine conflict can mirror human conflict without being a literal record. Still, it's possible that myth can preserve memories in coded form, especially memories of disruption that are too painful or too politically risky to describe directly. Your first light joke arrives as you picture a room of people listening to a myth recitation. You realise myth might be the earliest form of binge-worthy content, except you cannot skip ads because the ad is the priest reminding you to bring offerings. You smile quietly and keep listening in your mind. Now the topic's central phrase returns carefully handled. When people hear sky beings or those who came down, modern imaginations sometimes jump to arrival narratives. But one interpretation is that descent language can be metaphorical, describing authority flowing from a higher realm to a lower one, or ritual reenactment of cosmic order. This is suggestive, not conclusive. The evidence we do have points to complex metaphor and ritual, not clear travel logs. And yet the misty side of the story invites a different angle framed as possibility. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if certain myth patterns feel less like a triumphant arrival and more like a tense relocation, a movement under pressure? We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues, and one clue is emotional tone. Some myths feel like celebrations of order, but others carry a sense that something was lost, that the world was rearranged at a cost. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki and related divine groups in Mesopotamian tradition preserve a memory of outsiders who were not simply gods in the spiritual sense, but a class of beings or elites remembered later as divine. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin, but it persists in popular imagination because it offers a concrete answer to symbolic language. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a storytelling lens that asks what kind of historical experience could inspire the feeling of gods leaving, withdrawing, or going silent. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not saying aliens wrote Mesopotamian myths. We are saying that myths can be read on multiple levels. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and in this case, evidence for literal non-human escapees is thin. The more cautious explanation could be that divine withdrawal language reflects political shifts, ecological stress, or the way people interpret misfortune as a change in cosmic favour. Historians still argue whether specific myths should be read primarily as ritual texts, political theology, moral teaching stories, or layered composites that changed with each copying and performance context. There's no full consensus because the texts have long transmission histories and because different cities and periods emphasize different things. That debate is not an obstacle. It is the whole point of reading ancient myth with care. You settle into the sensation of a story being told in a dim room. You hear the cadence, the deliberate repetitions, the names that carry weight. Most historians agree that storytelling in Mesopotamia is connected to temples and courts, and that myths often reinforce ideas of rightful rule. The evidence we do have points to kings being linked to divine approval, and to cosmic order being used as a model for social order. Here comes the interpretation angle that stays grounded. One interpretation is that when myths emphasize the defeat of chaos and the establishment of order, they reflect a society's need for stability in a landscape where floods, droughts, and political conflict can upend life quickly. A careful reading might suggest that cosmic struggle is a metaphor for civic struggle. When the gods impose order, the city hopes to do the same. When the gods argue, humans recognize their own councils and rivalries. Second light joke arrives because you can feel your brain wanting a little sugar. You imagine an ancient divine council meeting and think, it sounds suspiciously like any committee meeting except the minutes are carved into clay, and nobody can pretend they never said that thing. The gods probably wish they had invented reply, or just so they could regret it. Now you let the cinematic what-if drift in, still clearly framed as imagination, if we treat the escape idea as a possibility rather than a conclusion. you can imagine certain myth motifs differently. A god descending could be interpreted as arriving to intervene. But what if it is also a memory of someone moving downward into a safer place, like a leader leaving a vulnerable position and taking shelter within the system? A god withdrawing could be read as abandonment, but what if it is also a poetic way to describe an elite group departing, leaving the city to manage itself with only the institutions and routines they built? To be clear, this is debated and we are not claiming it as historical fact. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. The evidence we do have points to myths being symbolic, but symbols often gather around real experiences. It's possible that societies that endure repeated disruptions develop stories that encode both fear and resilience. You picture a scribe copying a mythline with the same care he copies a ration list. The stylus makes the same sound. The clay receives the same pressure. And that thought is oddly soothing. Whether the words are about grain or gods, they are still pressed by human hands in lamplight. The past becomes intimate not through certainty, but through touch. Third light joke, soft and sleepy. You imagine the scribe finishing a cosmic epic setting down his stylus, and then immediately being asked to copy a list of fish names for tomorrow's lesson. The universe is grand, but the workplace remains the workplace. Most historians agree that over time myths can be repurposed and reinterpreted, especially when political power shifts. The evidence we do have points to later rulers and cities adopting older traditions and adjusting them to fit new identities. Archaeology suggests that this is not deception so much as continuity through adaptation. People inherit stories the way they inherit buildings they renovate. And so you hold two truths at once. On the solid ground, myths like Enuma Elish reflect religious and political thought in Mesopotamia, shaped by ritual kingship and cultural memory. On the misty edge, an imaginative reading can ask, what if some of the language that sounds like arrival could also be heard as departure if you listen for it that way? Not as proof, not as confirmation, but as a mood, a possibility, a way of letting the ancient words feel less like a closed book and more like an open question. You keep walking through the night city, letting the fan-like hum of distant life blend with the imagined chant of myth. The lamp smoke curls, the clay waits, and you let the stories settle around you like a blanket that is old, carefully stitched and full of threads that still catch the light. You follow the city's edge toward where the ground dips and the air grows wetter, and even without seeing the river yet, you can taste it. The scent is muddy and alive, like stirred earth after rain. Reeds whisper against each other in the breeze, making a soft brushing sound that feels like the world clearing its throat. Somewhere a frog does its best impression of a tiny drum, and you think with sleepy respect that nature never stops practicing. Most historians agree that life in southern Mesopotamia is inseparable from rivers and canals. Archaeology suggests that irrigation networks helped support agriculture and dense settlement, and that communities invested significant labour into managing water. The evidence we do have points to a landscape where flooding can be both a gift and a threat. Water brings silt and fertility, and water also brings chaos when it rises at the wrong time or in the wrong way. You are standing in a place where the line between plenty and disaster is sometimes measured in inches. You walk along a canal bank and feel how engineered it is, how human it looks, despite being made of earth and water. This is not wilderness water. This is negotiated water. Most historians agree that canal maintenance and irrigation management are essential to early urban life, and the evidence we do have points to organised labour being used to dig clear and repair waterways. Archaeology suggests that controlling water is one of the foundations of power, because if you control water, you control crops, and if you control crops, you control who eats. One interpretation is that water management shapes the moral imagination of the region. A careful reading might suggest that when your survival depends on keeping water in its place, your stories naturally treat flooding as more than weather. Flood becomes a symbol of disorder, a cosmic warning that the boundary between human plans and nature's mood can vanish overnight. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that river life teaches people to think in cycles of control and loss. Your first light joke arrives when you notice how much work goes into keeping a canal usable. You imagine an ancient official announcing a community canal cleaning day with the same cheerful tone modern people use for team building. And you realise humanity has always been capable of turning hard labour into a motivational event. Somewhere someone is probably handing out extra beer rations as an incentive, which is honestly the only reward system that makes sense. Now the flood motif drifts in not as a jump scare, but as a familiar story shape. What's broadly accepted is that flood narratives appear across Mesopotamian traditions, and that later famous versions have older roots. The evidence we do have points to the flood theme being deeply embedded in regional memory and myth-making. Archaeology suggests that floods and water-related disruptions are real experiences in the river plains, even if any single story's details are not straightforward history. One interpretation is that flood myths compress multiple events into one dramatic narrative. A careful reading might suggest that instead of describing one precise disaster with a date and a map, the story gathers the emotional truth of many floods, many evacuations, many ruined fields, and many anxious nights, listening to water move where it should not. It's possible that the myth is not a diary entry, but a cultural pressure valve, a way of turning recurring fear into a tale with structure, meaning, and maybe even a sense of control. Historians still argue whether specific flood stories preserve memory of particular regional events, function mainly as theological teaching, or serve as political and moral commentary that changes with each retelling. There's no full consensus because the texts come from different times and places, and because myth is rarely pinned to one single cause. The debate itself is part of the landscape, like the river's shifting course. You pause and let your eyes follow the water. It looks calm right now, but you can feel its potential. The river does not need your permission. Most historians agree that floods can be sudden and destructive, and the evidence we do have points to societies building systems to reduce risk, including levees, canals, and coordinated labour. Archaeology suggests that these efforts are uneven, sometimes successful, sometimes overwhelmed. Now the mystery theory portion enters carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that in some flood stories, the flood might be metaphorical as well as literal, a symbol for invasion, social collapse, or pursuit something that forces flight. This theory isn't widely accepted and it can easily be stretched too far. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it offers a gentle storytelling question. What if the word flood sometimes stands in for the feeling of being overtaken, whether by water, conflict or fear? Let me rephrase that more carefully. The mainstream explanation remains strong. Rivers flood, people suffer, stories form. Still, it is possible that symbolic language layers meanings. A careful reading might suggest that when a text describes the world being washed clean, it could reflect both literal inundation and the social experience of losing what you built. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You listen to the reads and imagine a reciter telling a flood story in a lamplit room. The audience knows the river. They have seen it rise. When the storyteller says the waters came, the listeners do not need special effects. Their bodies already remember. That is why the flood motif sticks. It's not only an idea, it is a lived possibility. Second light joke, because the mood is getting too deep and you deserve a soft laugh. You picture a very serious ancient priest explaining cosmic flood theology and someone in the back of the room whispering, "Okay, but can the gods also explain why the canal keeps clogging with reeds?" The priest ignores them because some questions are too practical for theology and some are too embarrassing to answer to. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian communities developed administrative systems partly to manage risks and resources, and the evidence we do have points to record keeping being essential in tracking land labour and distributions. Archaeology suggests that when water affects harvests, it affects everything downstream in society, including wages, rations, and political stability. In other words, flood is not just a natural event, it is an economic event, a social event, and sometimes a political event. One interpretation is that this is why flood language can carry moral weight. A careful reading might suggest that floods become narrative tools for talking about legitimacy. If rulers claim divine favour, then disaster raises uncomfortable questions. When water ruins the harvest, someone has to explain why. Myths can offer explanations that protect social cohesion. They can say the gods were angry, or the world needed renewal, or order had to be re-established. Those explanations may not satisfy a modern meteorologist, but they might satisfy a frightened city trying to stay united. Now you let the central theme of tonight's mystery approach, the river's edge, still cautious and clearly labelled as imaginative possibility. If someone enjoys the idea that the Anunnaki did not arrive, but escape flood narratives can be read through that lens as well. Not as proof, not as confirmation, but as a mood. What if the flood in a story is the pressure that forces departure? What if the beings in the myth are not stepping down triumphantly, but stepping away quietly as if the world they manage became too unstable to hold? To be clear, this is debated. Most historians agree that deities in these texts are religious figures, not documentary portraits of literal visitors. The more cautious explanation could be that flood stories are theological and cultural responses to real environmental volatility. But if we treat the escape idea as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it invites a specific kind of question. What if some myths preserve the feeling of an exit, of a withdrawal of authority leaving the scene? Because that is what it feels like when institutions fail and no one knows who is in charge anymore. Third light joke arrives gentle and sleepy. You imagine an ancient hero building a boat while everyone else argues about whether the flood is coming, and you think with modern admiration that the earliest survival skill might be ignoring group chats and just doing the work. If the world is going to flood, at least someone is out here quietly collecting reeds and pretending they have a plan. You breathe slowly, matching the river's pace. The water moves indifferent and constant. The reeds sway. The canal bank holds for now. Most historians agree that the relationship between people and water in Mesopotamia is a long negotiation, and archaeology suggests that the traces of that negotiation appear in settlements, fields, and administrative systems. The evidence we do have points to resilience built from repetition, dredge, the canal, repair, the bank, plant again, count again, hope again. And so the flood motif becomes something more than a scary story. It becomes a nightly reminder of how fragile and how persistent humans can be. On solid ground you see rivers shaping cities and records and survival. In the misty margin you allow the possibility that flood can also be the name of any overwhelming force that makes people leave, whether they call it water fate or the gods turning away. You do not pin it down. You let it flow because some mysteries are truest when they remain questions moving quietly through the dark, like water under moonlight. You leave the wet smell of reeds behind and return to streets where the ground is drier and the air tastes of smoke and grain and human closeness. The city at night is not silent. It simply changes its sounds. Footsteps become softer, doors close. Somewhere a baby complains with the timeless certainty of someone who knows the universe should be better organized. A dog barks once, then decides it has said enough. You drift toward a room where voices are lower and more deliberate. The kind of space where words matter because they shape how people imagine the world. You do not see a grand stage. You see a circle of listeners, a lamp, a storyteller, and the slow confidence of a tradition that expects to outlive everyone present. Tonight, the word that keeps hovering near the lamp flame is Anunnaki. Most historians agree that the term Anunnaki appears in Mesopotamian traditions as a collective label for a group of deities, and that its usage and connotations shift over time and by context. The evidence we do have points to a religious landscape where divine groups are not fixed like museum labels. They are living categories that change with politics, local cults, and the needs of storytelling. Archaeology suggests that different cities emphasize different gods and divine assemblies, and that the pantheon is more like a crowded town meeting than a neat family tree. You let that mainstream anchor settle first. What's broadly accepted is that divine terminology in these traditions can be fluid. A god can have multiple titles. A divine group can overlap with another group. The same name can be used with different shades of meaning depending on the period and the genre of the text. One interpretation is that later readers sometimes want the term Anunnaki to mean one stable thing, because stable things are easier to sell, easier to summarize, easier to put on a thumbnail. But ancient religion is not always cooperative like that. Your first light joke slips in as you imagine trying to explain the pantheon to someone who just wants a simple answer. You think with sleepy amusement that if ancient gods had customer service, the hold music would last 3 days, and the representative would say, "Your request has been forwarded to the Divine Council," and then nothing would happen until next season. You smile and keep listening. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian texts often speak of assemblies, of gods, councils, and ranked divine beings reflecting a worldview where the cosmos has governance. The evidence we do have points to myths describing decisions made by groups of deities, sometimes with a high god, sometimes with shifting leadership depending on city and era. Archaeology suggests that such ideas align with how human societies organize, especially in city-states, with councils, priests and kings all negotiating power. Now your interpretation angle arrives, signposted gently. One interpretation is that divine councils mirror human political life. When humans gather to decide who has authority, they imagine the gods doing the same. A careful reading might suggest that when a text says the Anunnaki gathered, it may be reflecting the feel of an elite meeting a tribunal or an administrative decision translated into cosmic language. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that the term Anunnaki sometimes functions as a narrative tool for legitimacy. If a decision comes from the Council of Gods, it sounds bigger than a decision made by a tired human official who has not slept. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were consistently imagined as underworld judges, high-ranking deities, ancestral powers, or a flexible divine group label used differently across regions and time periods. There's no full consensus because the texts are layered, the traditions change, and the surviving evidence is uneven. That uncertainty is not a flaw. It is a natural feature of a world where religion evolves. You keep your feet on the solid ground again. Most historians agree that many Mesopotamian divine names and categories can be traced across time, but meanings drift. The evidence we do have points to continuity in certain core ideas like divine authority and cosmic order, alongside shifts in emphasis and narrative style. Archaeology suggests that as empires and languages change, so do religious vocabularies, even when older terms remain in use. Now the misty portion still carefully framed as possibility. If you are someone who enjoys the escape theory, the shifting meaning of Anunnaki becomes interesting. Because if the term is not stable, then it is easier for modern imaginations to pour new meanings into it. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were not merely gods in a religious sense, but a remembered group of powerful beings whose identity was gradually mythologized. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin, but it persists because fluid terms feel like open doors. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the question becomes gentle and specific. What if the very ambiguity is part of why the rumour survives? Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not claiming ambiguity equals secret truth. We are saying ambiguity leaves room for interpretation, and humans, being humans, love to decorate empty space. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You imagine how a term might shift in daily life. A priest might use it one way in a hymn, a scribe might use it another way in a learned text. A storyteller might use it as a dramatic chorus of divine voices. Over time, a label can become a container, and containers can hold different things depending on who is carrying them. Second light joke arrives when you picture a scribe arguing with another scribe about terminology. You think with fond disbelief that the first academic debate might have been someone saying, "No, you are using that divine group name wrong," and the other person replying, "Language evolves." Somewhere the gods are rolling their eyes, which is probably the only thing the pantheon agrees on. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion is not monolithic, and that local traditions matter. The evidence we do have points to city patron gods having special prominence, and to myths being adapted to local needs. Archaeology suggests that religious practice is embedded in civic identity. When your city thrives, your god looks powerful. When your city struggles, your theology may grow more anxious, more complex, more interested in explaining why the world feels unfair. Here is an interpretation angle that keeps the tone safe and grounded. One interpretation is that divine groupings like Anunnaki can help communities process change. If power shifts from one city to another, the cosmic order in story can shift as well, making political change feel less like chaos and more like destiny. A careful reading might suggest that divine councils provide a narrative framework for transitions humans cannot fully control. Now the cinematic what-if mood returns softly. What if in some moments of real crisis the language of gods, withdrawing gods, departing, or gods being reassigned, reflects a human experience of leadership leaving? Not necessarily literal beings escaping, but the feeling of abandonment when institutions fail, when elites relocate, when protection disappears. It's possible that later listeners heard those stories and felt the same ache you feel when a city loses its centre of gravity. And if you are playing with the escape theory as gentle imagination, you can let one more question float. What if the phrase "they came down" is not the beginning of the story, but the middle? What if the real beginning, now lost, was something like, "They were here and the descent is a retreat into a protected role, into temples and councils and sealed spaces, because the world outside became too unstable"? That is a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, and mainstream scholarship does not treat these texts as literal extraterrestrial memoirs. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist by returning to what we can say with confidence. Most historians agree that myth language is layered, that terms change, and that translations and interpretations vary. The evidence we do have points to scholars working carefully to map usage across contexts, but even careful work cannot erase every ambiguity. Some questions remain open because the past does not owe us clarity. Third light joke, because you deserve one as your eyes get heavy. You imagine the Anunnaki convening for a serious cosmic meeting, and then someone brings up an agenda item called Define Anunnaki, and suddenly the meeting runs all night, nobody agrees, and the minutes are somehow still missing. The universe may be vast, but bureaucracy is eternal. You slow your pace. The city's night sounds softened further. The lamplight in your mind steadies. The word Anunnaki remains not as a solved puzzle, but as a living term that shifts with time, culture, and context. On the mainstream side, it reflects an evolving pantheon and the way humans map power onto the cosmos. On the interpretive side, it can be read as a mirror of human councils and institutions. And in the gentle imagination, it can become a silhouette in the mist, suggesting not a clean arrival, but a complicated movement, a withdrawal, a story of leaving retold as divine drama. You let that ambiguity be soothing rather than frustrating, because in a bedtime story, a question can be a lullaby. It can rock you gently, reminding you that not everything needs a final answer tonight, only a calm path forward through the lamplight. You wander into a workshop space where the air smells like damp clay, wood shavings, and something faintly oily, like hands have been working here for hours, and will probably keep working here forever. A lamp hangs low, making shadows that stretch and shrink with every flicker. On a table sits a small cylinder seal, no bigger than a thumb, carved with tiny figures, so crisp you almost forget it is stone and not a miniature world. Most historians agree that cylinder seals in Mesopotamia functioned as markers of identity and authority used to secure containers, doors and tablets, and to authenticate transactions. Archaeology suggests that seals were personal possessions, often beautifully carved, and that their impressions appear widely in administrative contexts. The evidence we do have points to a society where trust increasingly relies on recognizable symbols, and where a person's seal can stand in for their presence. You watch someone roll the cylinder across wet clay, and the image unfurls like a tiny parade figures. Animals, perhaps a scene of offering or struggle, all compressed into a space smaller than your palm. It feels like the ancient world's way of saying, I was here, except with more artistry and less social media. One interpretation is that seals are not just practical tools, they are status statements. A careful reading might suggest that the imagery chosen for a seal communicates affiliation, legitimacy, and worldview. If your seal shows you approaching a deity, it says you understand the proper hierarchy. If your seal shows a heroic figure, it hints at the identity you want associated with your name. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that even routine security practices carry cultural messaging. Your first light joke arrives as you watch the seal impression dry. You realise the first brand logo might have been a tiny carved scene of cosmic authority, and the first influencer might have been the person whose seal everybody recognised at a glance. You can almost hear someone whispering, "Oh wow, that's a nice seal," with the same tone modern people use for designer shoes. Most historians agree that seal imagery varies across time and place, reflecting changing artistic styles and religious themes. The evidence we do have points to recurring motifs like worship scenes, divine figures, animals, and symbolic elements that signal power and order. Archaeology suggests that the spread of seal styles can reflect trade, cultural contact, and administrative influence. Now your interpretation angle deepens gently. One interpretation is that the repetition of certain motifs serves as a visual language of authority. A careful reading might suggest that when people see the same kind of worship scene again and again, it reinforces who is above and who is below, both in the divine realm and in society. The seal becomes a tiny lesson, not a lecture, just a repeated image that quietly teaches. Historians still argue whether particular seal motifs should be read primarily as religious devotion, political propaganda, personal aspiration, or standardized administrative iconography. That means different things depending on who is using it. There's no full consensus because art can be both sincere and strategic at the same time, and because the context of a seal impression is not always clear. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist by focusing on how seals are used. A sealed jar of grain, a sealed storeroom door, a sealed tablet that records a transaction. Most historians agree that sealing practices create accountability and deter tampering, and the evidence we do have points to seals being integral to managing resources in complex institutions. Archaeology suggests that seal impressions can help trace networks of administration, showing which officials or households interacted. Now the misty portion arrives clearly labelled and carefully handled. A fringe idea proposes that some seal imagery contains coded messages, not just symbolic scenes, perhaps indicating special groups, secret knowledge, or hidden identities. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it can easily become over-interpretation. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it offers a calm question. What if certain images served as signals for insiders in the same way uniforms or insignia can identify a role without words? Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not saying seals are alien QR codes. We are saying that symbols can communicate membership and authority. In any complex society, insiders recognize things outsiders miss. The evidence we do have points to seals being personal and institutional markers. It's possible that some imagery is chosen precisely because it speaks to a specific circle. You look closer at the tiny carved figures and notice how the scenes often show movement approaching, presenting, being led, being welcomed. Even without knowing every meaning, you can feel the social choreography. Someone approaches power, someone receives approval, someone is placed within order. That is where the knight's central theory can be explored safely as cinematic what if you're imagining that powerful beings did not arrive, but escaped seals become interesting objects. Because seals are used for controlled movement of goods and access. If an elite group needed to relocate quietly, it would need symbols that authorize movement, symbols that open doors, symbols that make a transfer look routine. You are not claiming this happened. You are asking what it would look like if it did. And the answer is, it would look a lot like administration with seals and lists and controlled storerooms. Second light joke arrives as you imagine an ancient official guarding a storeroom. You think with sleepy amusement that the first security system might have been a guy with a seal and a very suspicious eyebrow. If you want to get into the temple storeroom, you do not hack a code. You convince a human being who has seen every trick in the book. Most historians agree that artistry and administration are intertwined in these objects, and the evidence we do have points to seals being both functional tools and personal treasures. Archaeology suggests that some seals were worn, carried and treated as valuable property. Losing your seal could be a disaster, not just emotionally, but legally, because your identity and authority travel with it. Now, your interpretation angle widens again. One interpretation is that identity in such a system becomes portable. A careful reading might suggest that your seal allows you to act at a distance. You can authorize a transaction without being physically present because your symbol stands in. That is a quiet revolution. It changes how power moves. It makes networks possible. It makes control scalable. And now a cinematic possibility still framed as imagination. What if in a time of political stress, portability of identity becomes a survival tool? If a group needs to shift its operations, it can move not only supplies but authority itself, carried on small stones and pressed into clay. Again, this is not proof of escape. It is a way of imagining how an escape would look if it were hidden inside routine. You keep the language safe. The more cautious explanation could be that seals simply evolved because complex economies need secure authentication. Most historians agree that is the mainstream story, and it is strong. Still, it's possible that the same tools used for ordinary administration could also be used in extraordinary moments. Third light joke arrives gentle as a yawn. You imagine a scribe misplacing a seal and the entire city pausing because suddenly nobody can authorize anything. The ancient world's version of the server is down might have been the seal is missing, and everyone just stands around until someone finds it under a basket. You watch another impression being rolled, and the tiny scene appears again, crisp and confident. The image is small, but the implications are big. On the mainstream side, seals show us how identity, authority and security worked in early Mesopotamian life. On the interpretive side, they show how symbols reinforce hierarchy and belonging. And in the misty imagination, they become little keys suggesting how people could move goods and power quietly, perhaps even how a departure could be disguised as business as usual. You let the seal's impression dry in your mind and feel a kind of calm admiration. Civilization is built not only on grand monuments, but on small repetitive acts. Roll the seal press, the wedge, close the jar, record the ration. The city keeps breathing, and you keep walking following the tiniest artifacts, because sometimes the smallest objects carry the biggest stories, not as certainty but as possibility. You follow a lane that widens into a busier path, and the smell of the city shifts again, this time toward tar damp rope and the sharp, clean bite of river air. You hear it before you see it, a low chorus of water against wood, and wood against wood, like boats whispering to each other in the dark. Then the riverfront opens up and you find a place that never truly sleeps, even when the rest of the city tries. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cities were connected by rivers, canals, and overland routes that carried goods, people, and ideas. Archaeology suggests that trade networks moved staples like grain and textiles, and also luxury items like metals, stones, and timbers from distant regions. The evidence we do have points to a world where southern Mesopotamia, lacking certain raw materials, relied on exchange to obtain what it needed. In other words, civilization here is not only built upward in temples and walls, it is built outward in connections. You stand near a moored boat and watch the quiet choreography of loading. Sacks, bundles, jars sealed with clay. A man checks a tag, another tightens a rope. A scribe is nearby, not dramatic, just present because the movement of goods is the movement of power, and power likes receipts. One interpretation is that trade is not only about commerce, it is about relationships. A careful reading might suggest that when a city depends on imported materials, it depends on agreements, alliances, and shared expectations across distance. Trade becomes diplomacy with better packaging. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that the riverfront is also a political stage where every transaction is a small negotiation of trust. Your first light joke arrives as you watch a boat captain argue softly with someone about the weight of a bundle. You think with sleepy delight that international trade might be the oldest source of human drama, and the first global language might have been "this is heavier than you said it was." Some things do not change, they just get new paperwork. Most historians agree that boats and barges on the rivers were vital for transport, because water travel can carry heavy loads more efficiently than overland hauling. The evidence we do have points to rivers functioning as highways, and archaeology suggests that riverine transport supported both everyday provisioning and long-distance exchange. You can feel it here. The river is a corridor, and the city leans into it like a person leaning into a wind that can carry news. Now your interpretation angle slides in gently. One interpretation is that trade routes also enable movement of people, not just goods. Merchants travel, craftsmen relocate, officials go on assignments, families move. A careful reading might suggest that what looks like trade in the record can sometimes include human displacement, whether voluntary or forced. This is a careful point. We are not claiming every shipment hides a secret migration. We are saying that in any large system, categories overlap. A boat carrying textiles might also carry a clerk. A caravan hauling copper might also carry a child sent to live with relatives. Historians still argue whether certain episodes of Mesopotamian expansion and contact reflect mostly peaceful commerce and cultural exchange, or include significant colonization, elite, migration, and imposed administration. There's no full consensus because evidence is scattered and different regions show different patterns. The debate matters because it shapes how you imagine the riverfront. Is it a marketplace, a frontier, a bridge, a lever of power, or all of those at once? You keep the solid ground separate from the mist, by returning to what's broadly accepted. Southern Mesopotamia lacked many raw materials, so trade and exchange were essential. The evidence we do have points to wide networks reaching toward regions that could supply stone, metal, timber, and other necessities. Archaeology suggests that objects found in Mesopotamian contexts can indicate long-distance connections, even if the exact routes and intermediaries are hard to map. Now the misty portion arrives clearly framed as possibility. If you are playing with the escape theory, trade becomes a particularly tempting lens. A fringe idea proposes that if a powerful group ever needed to leave quietly, it would use existing trade networks as cover. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for literal non-human escapees is thin, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it offers a calm, cinematic question. What if departure looks exactly like commerce, because commerce is movement that no one questions? Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not saying trade records hide a cosmic evacuation. We are saying that systems built for routine movement can also carry extraordinary movement if circumstances demand it. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You watch sealed jars being carried onto a boat. The seals matter. The lists matter. The people checking them matter. Most historians agree that administrative tools like seals and tablets support these movements by tracking ownership and obligations. The evidence we do have points to a world where the flow of goods is regulated and where official marks create a chain of responsibility. Archaeology suggests that the presence of standardized administrative practices helps large networks function. Second light joke arrives as you imagine a scribe trying to record everything at the riverfront. You think with sympathy that the first burnout in history probably happened right here. The scribe is squinting at a stack of tablets, and someone keeps shouting new numbers at him. He is living the ancient version of please stop emailing me after 5 p.m, except it is always 5 p.m. when you live near a port. Now your interpretation angle deepens into the human experience. One interpretation is that trade and movement create cultural blending. Ideas travel with goods. Practices spread. Stories change. A careful reading might suggest that when you see similarities between distant regions, it can reflect contact and exchange, not necessarily conquest. This is important because it keeps the story grounded. Civilizations are not isolated islands. They are networks, and networks are the opposite of simple narratives. Now you let the cinematic what if hover again, but you keep it honest. If the Anunnaki escape theory is treated as imagination, then the river becomes a stage for that imagination. What if a departure is hidden in plain sight, not because someone wants to trick you 4,000 years later, but because in any time of danger, people use the channels that already exist? If you need to leave quickly, you do not invent a new route. You take the road people already travel, you take the river, you take the boat. To be clear, this is debated, and mainstream historians do not interpret Mesopotamian trade as evidence of alien flight. The more cautious explanation could be that the leaving in myths reflects political turnover, environmental stress, or the normal human experience of losing confidence in leaders. Still, it's possible that the emotional shape of departure, the sense that authority withdrew, can cling to the places where movement happens. Ports and riverfronts are always haunted by goodbyes, even when the goodbyes are ordinary. Third light joke arrives warm and sleepy. You imagine a boatman watching all this and thinking, people keep talking about gods and kings, but I'm the one doing the actual work. Then he spits into the river with quiet satisfaction, which is basically the ancient equivalent of muting the conversation. You walk along the riverbank and let your eyes follow the boats disappearing into darkness. The city behind you is full of walls and archives and temples. The river beside you is full of motion and uncertainty. Most historians agree that this combination, solid institutions plus moving networks, is part of what makes Mesopotamian civilization resilient and influential. The evidence we do have points to connectivity shaping power. And in the misty margins, you allow one last question to drift, like a lantern on water. If a story about divine beings is really a story about authority, and authority sometimes leaves, then where would that leaving feel most real? Not at the Ziggurats' top, not in a scribe's classroom, but here where ropes creak, seals press, and the river carries things away without ever looking back. You step away from the riverfront and into streets that feel narrower now. Not because they actually are, but because the night has deepened and your attention has softened. The lamps are fewer, the shadows are longer. You can smell baking brick and cooling ash, and somewhere a goat makes a small complaining sound that feels like it is reviewing the entire concept of nighttime. You find yourself back in the orbit of the temple economy, not at the grand steps and terraces, but in the quiet machinery behind them. Storerooms, courtyards, work areas where people are moving like parts of a well-practiced routine. This is where the sacred and the practical shake hands. So often they forget they were ever separate. Most historians agree that temples in early Mesopotamian cities were major landholders and economic institutions, managing fields, herds, workshops, and the distribution of rations. Archaeology suggests that the scale of administrative records reflects organized systems for collecting and redistributing goods, and the evidence we do have points to temples being central nodes in the city's survival. In other words, the temple is not only a place where you pray, it is a place where you eat. You watch workers carry baskets into a storeroom and you notice how calm it all looks. Not relaxed exactly, but orderly. Someone checks a seal impression. Someone counts. Someone records. Someone waits with the patient expression of a person whose whole job is standing next to a doorway and making sure nothing interesting happens. If you have ever stood in a line at a government office, you suddenly feel deep ancestral connection. One interpretation is that this economic role strengthens the temple's authority in a way that can feel invisible. A careful reading might suggest that when the institution that feeds you is also the institution that defines the sacred social order becomes harder to question. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that devotion and dependency reinforce each other. When you receive rations under the god's name, gratitude and obligation blend. Your first light joke arrives as you imagine a priest explaining a distribution policy. You think with sleepy amusement that the earliest sermon might have included a line like, "The gods want you to receive exactly this amount of barley, no more, no less." And everyone nodded, because arguing with the cosmos is a bold move when the storeroom keys are in the priest's pocket. Most historians agree that many administrative tablets include ration lists, labour assignments, and records of deliveries. The evidence we do have points to standardised measures, officials, and procedures that allow large institutions to function. Archaeology suggests that these systems reflect real economic complexity, not just religious performance, and in a practical sense it is impressive. You are watching a society invent the tools of large-scale management without spreadsheets, without calculators, and without caffeine, which is frankly heroic. Now your interpretation angle deepens gently. One interpretation is that the temple system creates stability, but also concentrates vulnerability. If a temple controls major storage and distribution, then disruption to the temple disrupts the whole city. A careful reading might suggest that political conflict, environmental stress, or administrative failure can ripple outward quickly. When the storerooms close, the city feels it in its stomach. Historians still argue whether the temple economy should be understood primarily as a redistributive welfare, like system-a-form of elite control over labour and surplus, a genuine religious offering cycle, or a shifting blend that varies by period and city. There's no full consensus because the evidence is complex and the meaning of records depends on context. The debate matters because it shapes how you read the temple's role, guardian manager, employer, or ruler, in a different costume. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist by returning to what's broadly accepted. Temples had personnel, land, and administrative capacity. The evidence we do have points to specialised roles: priests, administrators, scribes, craftsmen, labourers. Archaeology suggests workshops linked to temples produced goods, and the institutions coordinated large projects. This is not a fairy tale. It is an organisational system, and it changes how humans live. Now the misty portion arrives clearly framed as possibility. A fringe idea proposes that temple institutions might have served as more than religious and economic centres, perhaps as guardians of specialised knowledge or controlled information. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it can easily become exaggerated. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it offers a calm question. What if the most valuable commodity in the temple was not grain, but coordination? The ability to direct people, resources, and decisions. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not claiming secret alien technology is stored behind every temple wall. We are saying institutions often protect what gives them power: records, procedures, relationships, and trained personnel. The evidence we do have points to writing and sealing being central. It's possible that control over information is as important as control over food. A second light joke arrives when you imagine a temple administrator hearing that phrase, control over information, and nodding solemnly because administrators have always known that the true power is knowing where the forms are kept. You picture a storeroom labelled tablets about tablets, and honestly, it feels plausible. Now you let the night's central theme of escape drift into this environment still carefully labelled as imagination. If someone enjoys the idea that the Anunnaki did not arrive but escaped the temple economy, offers a particular cinematic picture. What if an orderly departure would require an institution capable of moving resources without causing panic? What if the temple with its storeroom seals and distribution routines could shift supplies and personnel quietly? Not because the temple is hiding cosmic beings, but because any organised system can be used for extraordinary logistics when needed. To be clear, this is debated, and mainstream history does not present temples as evacuation hubs for non-human groups. The more cautious explanation could be that myths of divine withdrawal reflect the human experience of institutional failure, drought, war, or political turnover. Still, it's possible that when people say the gods left, they are also saying the system stopped protecting us. In that sense, divine departure is a symbolic way to describe the loss of a stable distribution network. You watch a worker receive a ration and step away. It looks simple, but behind that simplicity is a chain of decisions who qualifies how much, when, under what conditions. Most historians agree that such systems require rules and enforcement, and the evidence we do have points to administrative precision being necessary. Archaeology suggests that record keeping helps prevent disputes, but it can also create them because when people are hungry, they notice exactly who got more. One interpretation is that this is where the sacred language becomes socially useful. A careful reading might suggest that tying distribution to divine order reduces conflict, because arguing with the priest is one thing, but arguing with the gods is risky. This is not necessarily cynical. It can be a sincere belief system that holds a community together, but it also has a practical effect. It stabilizes compliance. Third light joke arrives gentle and sleepy. You imagine a hungry worker staring at his ration and thinking, I respect the divine order, but I would also like a slightly larger divine order. You can almost hear the temple official reply, take it up with the heavens, which is the oldest customer service deflection known to humanity. You let your attention drift to the tablets again, because the temple economy runs on writing as much as on grain. Names, amounts, dates, seals. The evidence we do have points to a world where documents create reality. And in that world, an absence can be as meaningful as a presence. If a name disappears from a list, something changed. If a storeroom record stops, something happened. If offerings are recorded differently, the system is shifting. Now the cinematic what if returns in a softer voice. What if the story of gods escaping is at its heart a story about the sudden loss of institutional certainty? The city wakes up and the routines feel hollow. The rations feel smaller. The seals feel less reassuring. The temple still stands, but the sense of protection is thinner. That is not proof of anything cosmic. It is a human feeling that myths can translate into divine language. You keep walking through the temple's working spaces, listening to the quiet sounds, of coordination footsteps, baskets, the scratch of stylus on clay. On the mainstream side, you see how temples organize economy and social order. On the interpretive side, you see how dependency and legitimacy reinforce each other. And in the gentle imagination, you can picture how an escape, if it ever happened in any form, would not be loud. It would be procedural. It would be sealed, counted, recorded, and disguised as routine, because routine is the best hiding place in a city that runs on routine. You drift into a part of the city where the streets feel tighter and the walls feel closer, as if the buildings have leaned in to listen. The night air carries a faint grit that sticks to your tongue, the kind that makes you want water even if you are not thirsty. Somewhere, someone is repairing a mud brick wall by lamplight, smoothing wet clay into cracks with the calm patience of a person who has accepted that maintenance is a lifestyle. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian city life includes periods of conflict, rivalry, and political change because city-states compete for land, water, labour, and prestige. Archaeology suggests that fortifications, weapons, and destruction layers in some contexts reflect episodes of violence, while texts can hint at disputes, raids, and shifting alliances. The evidence we do have points to a world where power is often negotiated and sometimes taken, and where the stability of any single city is never guaranteed. You keep your shoulders relaxed as you move past a gate area, noticing how the city's edges are designed to control entry. A guard watches you with the sleepy intensity of someone whose job is both boring and crucial. You can feel the social tension that comes with living behind walls. Walls are comfort, but they are also a reminder that someone out there might want what you have. One interpretation is that conflict shapes not only politics, but belief. A careful reading might suggest that when a city experiences repeated threat, its stories grow more focused on order, protection, and divine backing. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that some myth language about gods choosing favourites or withdrawing favour reflects the emotional rhythm of political stress. When things go well, the gods smile. When things go poorly, people look for reasons, and myth provides a vocabulary for disappointment. Your first light joke slips in as you imagine a council meeting about defence. You picture a very serious official saying, "We need stronger walls," and a scribe quietly adding, "We also need fewer arguments," which is not a weapon, but it might help. You smile, because even in a world of spears and mud brick, the biggest threat is sometimes a group project. Most historians agree that environmental conditions also affect stability in the region, with water supply and agricultural productivity being critical. Archaeology suggests that drought signals and shifting river patterns can contribute to stress, even if the details vary by region and period. The evidence we do have points to the basic reality that when harvests fail or become unpredictable, societies feel it immediately. Food is not just food. It is wages, ritual offerings, political legitimacy, and social peace. You stop near a courtyard where stored grain is being guarded like it is a small mountain of life. The smell is dry and faintly sweet. You imagine how much hope is packed into those kernels. A more cautious explanation could be that many changes in ancient cities are slow the result of layered pressures rather than a single dramatic event. Still, it's possible that people living through such times experience them as sudden, because the moment you cannot guarantee tomorrow's bread time speeds up in your chest. Historians still argue whether major episodes of urban disruption in Mesopotamia are best explained by environmental change, internal political conflict, external pressure, economic shifts, or a complicated blend where no single cause gets to wear the crown. There's no full consensus because evidence differs by site and period, and because human societies rarely collapse in one neat way. The debate matters because it keeps you honest. It prevents the bedtime story from turning into a single simple explanation. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, you have cities that rise and fall, sometimes gradually, sometimes sharply affected by politics, war, and climate variability. On the misty side, you have the human impulse to translate stress into story and story into divine drama. Now, your mystery theory portion enters carefully, clearly labelled. A fringe idea proposes that when ancient texts speak of gods departing councils, breaking or divine protection, fading, it could reflect not only symbolic theology, but an encoded memory of leadership withdrawing, perhaps elites relocating, perhaps institutions failing. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it offers a calm question. What if the gods left? Is the poetic version of the system stopped working? Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not saying a tablet documents a literal escape by non-human beings. We are saying that symbols can carry social memory. When a city is stressed, people feel abandoned. When a ruler flees or an institution collapses, it can feel like the sky itself changed. It's possible that later storytellers used divine language to express that experience. Second light joke arrives because the topic can get heavy. You imagine a farmer looking at a dry field and saying, "I would like to file a complaint with the heavens." Then you imagine the heavens responding with silence, which is the ancient equivalent of an automated message. Your request is important to us. You laugh softly, then immediately feel sympathetic because behind the joke is a real human anxiety. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian political life includes rivalries between city-states, shifting hegemonies, and the rise of new powers over time. The evidence we do have points to kingship being both celebrated and contested, with rulers presenting themselves as chosen, strong and divinely supported. Archaeology suggests that monuments, inscriptions, and administrative changes can reflect these shifts even when details are incomplete. One interpretation is that rulers use divine language strategically. A careful reading might suggest that when a king says the gods favour him, he is also saying, "Do not question my authority." This is not necessarily cynical. It can be sincere belief and political messaging at once. The point is that divine departure language can be emotionally and politically useful. If things go badly, the gods can be blamed. If things go well, the gods can be thanked. Either way, the narrative protects the social structure, at least for a while. Now the cinematic. What if arrives still framed as imagination, still gentle? If you play with the escape theory as a story lens, you can picture a stressed city where certain powerful figures decide to withdraw rather than fight. Not aliens, not confirmed outsiders, just a group with resources and planning. What if their departure is masked by routine movements of goods? What if their names quietly vanish from ration lists? What if seals stop appearing? What if the temple storerooms feel slightly emptier, not because of magic, but because the people who manage them have moved on? To be clear, this is debated and it is not a mainstream claim. The more cautious explanation could be that administrative patterns shift because of war, drought, political change, or shifting institutions. Still, the image is useful for your bedtime imagination because it turns a vague sense of historical stress into a calm, cinematic scene. A quiet night, a few bundles, a sealed jar, footsteps that do not announce themselves. Third light joke arrives soft and sleepy. You imagine an ancient evacuation plan written on clay and think with amusement that it would be the least portable emergency plan in history. Step 1, grab the tablet. Step 2, do not drop the tablet. Step 3, realize you are now carrying a small brick. Even in danger, bureaucracy refuses to be convenient. You move through the city with a new awareness of fragility. Mud brick walls need constant repair. Canals need constant dredging. Politics needs constant negotiation. Most historians agree that maintaining urban life in this landscape requires ongoing labour and cooperation. The evidence we do have points to resilience, but also to the reality that resilience can be worn down. One interpretation is that this is why myths about divine departure resonate. When stress accumulates, people look for explanations that match the scale of their feelings. A careful reading might suggest that the larger the disruption, the more cosmic the language becomes. It's possible that escape is simply a modern word for the sense that protection left, certainty left familiar, authority left. You do not force the mystery into a conclusion. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is conflict, environmental stress, and the changing fortunes of cities. The mist is the imaginative possibility that some texts in their talk of gods withdrawing may echo the human experience of leaders leaving, institutions collapsing, or social order slipping away. And as you keep walking, you let the night hold both truths in a calm balance, like a lamp flame that stays steady even when the air shifts. You wander toward a quieter rooftop space where the city's smells thin out and the air feels cleaner, cooler, like the night has rinsed itself. Below you, the lanes twist between mud brick walls and lamps glow like small patient stars that have decided to live closer to the ground. Above you, the real stars spread out in a wide, dark bowl, and for a moment you forget about rations and seals and lists, because the sky makes everything feel both enormous and strangely personal. Most historians agree that people in Mesopotamia watched the sky carefully using celestial observation for calendars, seasonal timing, and systems of omen interpretation. Archaeology suggests that over time, Traditions of astronomical recording and omen literature developed and were transmitted in scribal contexts, and the evidence we do have points to a deep cultural investment in the idea that the heavens are meaningful. In other words, the night sky is not just pretty, it is a source of timekeeping prediction and reassurance. You sit with your knees drawn up, feeling the rooftop's warmth slowly fade. Somewhere a dog sighs. Somewhere else a voice calls softly and then goes quiet. The city is still alive, but it has lowered its voice, and that makes the sky feel louder, as if the stars are speaking in a language made of distance. One interpretation is that when life feels uncertain, the sky becomes a kind of anchor. A careful reading might suggest that celestial patterns offer a sense of order. In a world where rivers change course, politics shifts and harvests can fail. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that omen systems are not only superstition, they are also a coping strategy. If you can read the sky, you can tell yourself you are not helpless. You can tell yourself the universe leaves hints. Your first light joke arrives as you imagine an anxious official staring up at the stars and trying to interpret them. You think with sleepy amusement that the earliest form of doom scrolling might have been staring at a bright planet and whispering, "This can't mean anything good," while everyone nearby pretends to be calm. The sky is vast, but human worry is very efficient. Most historians agree that scribes and scholars in later Mesopotamian contexts compiled extensive omen series linking celestial events and other signs to possible outcomes. The evidence we do have points to a systematic approach where observations are categorized, recorded, and interpreted within learned traditions. Archaeology suggests that this knowledge circulated in elite settings, often connected to temples and courts. The sky becomes part of governance because if a king believes omens matter, then interpretation matters too. Now your interpretation angle deepens gently. One interpretation is that omen interpretation gives power to those who can speak confidently about uncertainty. A careful reading might suggest that when a priest or scholar interprets an eclipse or a strange celestial alignment, they are offering a narrative that can guide decisions, calm fears, or justify actions. This is not necessarily manipulation, it can be sincere belief. But it also has social effects. If the sky can be read, then the readers hold a kind of authority. Historians still argue whether omen literature and early astronomical observation were primarily practical tools for calendar keeping, religious frameworks, for understanding chance political instruments, for managing public anxiety, or a mixture that shifts by period and setting. There's no full consensus because the traditions evolve over centuries and because the same text can be used differently depending on who is listening and why. The debate matters because it keeps you from treating the sky as one single thing. The sky is a stage and different people use it for different plays. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist by returning to what's broadly accepted. People observed the heavens, they tracked patterns, they linked celestial cycles to timekeeping and seasonal life. The evidence we do have points to a growing sophistication in how observations were organised, even if the earliest phases are uneven, and hard to reconstruct, archaeology suggests that the discipline of careful watching is real, even if the meaning assigned to what is watched varies. Now the misty portion arrives clearly labelled and handled like a fragile object. A fringe idea proposes that ancient star knowledge may hint at something more than human curiosity, perhaps inherited from a mysterious source, perhaps reflecting an older tradition of advanced understanding. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin, but it persists because the sky feels like a place where secrets could hide. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a bedtime question rather than a claim. What if the sky was not only read for omens, but also remembered as a map? Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not saying the Sumerians had modern astrophysics, or a literal interstellar travel plan carved into clay. We are saying humans can be remarkably observant, and they can build complex interpretive systems from repeated patterns. The more cautious explanation could be that astronomy develops because it is useful and beautiful, and because a calendar matters when planting and harvesting determine survival. Still, it's possible that some myths and metaphors use celestial language as a way to speak about movement, destiny, and departure. Second light joke arrives as you imagine someone trying to use the stars to schedule temple duties. You think with affection that the first time someone said Mercury is in retrograde, it probably meant, I do not want to take responsibility for this mess. The sky becomes the world's oldest excuse, and honestly, it is a pretty good one. You look at a bright point of light near the horizon and let your imagination soften around it. In many ancient traditions, planets are not just objects, they are signs. They walk the sky like silent officials making appearances that people interpret as messages. Most historians agree that celestial phenomena like eclipses, comets, and unusual alignments were often treated as significant, and the evidence we do have points to them being woven into omen frameworks. One interpretation is that the emotional impact of such events is part of their power. A careful reading might suggest that when the sun darkens unexpectedly, or when a bright comet appears, the shock invites story. The mind wants a reason. The mind wants a warning. The mind wants an explanation that matches the scale of the sensation. And the sky being enormous inspires enormous explanations. Now, the central theme of tonight's Mystery Returns, still kept safely in the realm of interpretation and imagination, if someone enjoys the idea that the Anunnaki did not arrive but escaped sky language, becomes a tempting place to listen for echoes, not as proof, not as confirmation, as mood. What if stories about beings descending from heaven are not only about arrival, but about the direction of authority moving like a command, coming down through layers of administration? And what if stories about beings leaving, withdrawing, or becoming distant could be paired with the sky as a map of distance itself? To be clear, this is debated, and mainstream historians do not treat Mesopotamian omens as coded spacecraft navigation. The more cautious explanation could be that celestial reading is a human response to uncertainty and a tool for scheduling ritual and agriculture. Still, it's possible that the language of the sky can be used metaphorically to describe human movement. When someone important leaves, you might say they went beyond reach. You might even say they went back to the heavens, not because you think they literally did, but because distance feels like sky. Third light joke arrives soft and sleepy. You imagine a scribe trying to take notes on the stars with a clay tablet, and think with gentle sympathy that this is the least convenient stargazing notebook in history. You drop it once and your entire research project becomes a pile of crumbs. The stars remain perfect and your tablet becomes modern art. You breathe slowly, letting the rooftops' quiet settle into your chest. The city below you is built from mud brick and routine, but the sky above is built from distance and patience. Most historians agree that the tension between those two worlds, the immediate and the cosmic, is part of what makes Mesopotamian thought so compelling. The evidence we do have points to people using the sky to structure time, justify decisions, and find meaning. One interpretation is that when the ground feels unstable, people look up. A careful reading might suggest that this upward gaze is not escapism. It is strategy. It is comfort. It is the human attempt to place daily life inside a larger pattern. And in the gentle imagination, you can let one last question float like a lantern. What if the sky was also kind of exit sign in the cultural mind? Not because anyone literally fled to the stars, but because when something leaves, we instinctively place it somewhere higher and farther, somewhere beyond ordinary reach. You do not chase the question into certainty. You let it hover. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The stars keep shining either way, calm and indifferent, while you let your thoughts slow down and your body sink into the rooftops' quiet, as if the night itself is a long, steady breath. You move through a quieter corner of the city where the streets feel less like commerce and more like memory. The lamps are spaced farther apart, and between each pool of light there is a soft darkness that makes your footsteps sound louder than they are. A cat slips along a wall with the smooth confidence of a creature that believes it owns history. Somewhere a door closes with a wooden click, and the night seems to nod as if that sound is part of a routine it recognizes. This is the point where a modern mind, especially a curious one, often arrives with pockets full of questions and a flashlight that is a little too bright. Not because the past is hiding from you, but because you are used to stories that end with answers. Ancient evidence rarely does that. Most historians agree that our picture of Sumer and early Mesopotamia is built from fragments tablets that survive by chance sites that preserve unevenly texts copied and recopied, meanings that shift across time and language. The evidence we do have points to an extraordinary civilization, but not to a complete script with every scene included. Archaeology suggests that interpretation is always part of the work because artifacts do not narrate themselves. A tablet can record grain rations with incredible clarity and still leave you guessing about the emotions of the people receiving them. A broken statue can tell you something about artistic style and still keep silent about why it broke. This is why careful scholarship moves slowly, weighing possibilities, comparing contexts and accepting uncertainty as a normal companion. One interpretation is that uncertainty creates a vacuum that modern stories love to fill. A careful reading might suggest that when evidence is thin, imagination becomes louder. That is not automatically bad. Imagination can motivate interest and wonder, but it can also turn a puzzle into a certainty too quickly, which is where misunderstanding grows. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Your first light joke arrives as you imagine a modern person holding a photo of a clay tablet and declaring with complete confidence that it definitely says something dramatic. You think with sleepy amusement that humanity's most enduring talent is reading one line and writing an entire trilogy in its head. The ancient scribes would be impressed, or maybe just tired. Most historians agree that translation itself is a delicate process. Words in ancient languages can have ranges of meaning. Some terms are rare. Some phrases are idiomatic. Context matters. The evidence we do have points to scholars debating not only big interpretations, but single words. Archaeology suggests that texts are connected to material contexts, and that separating a line from its setting can distort its meaning. One interpretation is that modern audiences sometimes treat ancient terms like fixed labels when they are more like flexible tools. A careful reading might suggest that a word used in ritual poetry is not identical to a word used in an administrative list, even if it looks similar on the tablet. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that some sensational readings come from flattening different genres into one. Historians still argue whether certain mythic passages preserve echoes of historical experiences, function primarily as ritual performance, or serve as political theology that changes with each new copying tradition. There's no full consensus, and that is not a failure. It is the natural result of working with ancient material that is both rich and incomplete. Now you keep the solid ground separate from the mist by naming the boundaries clearly. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian and Mesopotamian myths talk about gods, order, kingship, and the forces of nature in symbolic language. Most historians agree that these texts are not straightforward chronicles of literal events. Archaeology suggests that the societies behind these myths were highly organized, deeply religious, and capable of complex administration and literature. The evidence we do have points to human creativity and institutional power working together. And then gently, you allow the mist to drift in, because people do love a good rumour. A popular rumour claims that ancient records contain hidden references to extraterrestrial beings, advanced technology, or secret histories of escape and exile. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for it is thin. Still, it remains culturally sticky because it offers something that pure uncertainty does not. A neat answer, a dramatic plot, and a feeling that you have discovered a hidden door. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were not merely divine figures in religion, but literal non-human escapees who used early civilization as a refuge, leaving clues in texts and imagery. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask a safer, more useful question. What kind of real human experience could generate stories that later readers interpret as escape narratives? That question keeps your feet on the ground even while your imagination stretches. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not saying the escape story is fact. We are saying the story functions like a modern metaphor for a feeling that might be ancient and human. The sense that authority arrives, organises, then withdraws, leaving people to manage the aftermath. It's possible that this pattern emerges naturally in societies that face cycles of stability and disruption. Second light joke arrives when you imagine someone trying to monetize a sensational interpretation in a marketplace. You think with sleepy humour that even in the ancient world, a person could probably sell anything if they began with "a secret tablet reveals" and then refused to show the tablet because it was conveniently in another city. The hustle is timeless. Most historians agree that modern misunderstandings often come from mixing sources from different periods or projecting later meanings backward onto earlier texts. The evidence we do have points to the danger of treating Mesopotamia as one frozen moment rather than a long changing history. Archaeology suggests that cultures evolve and that terms and myths shift with them. A more cautious explanation could be that many popular claims are built from stitching together unrelated details, then calling the stitch a seam in reality. One interpretation is that our brains are pattern machines. A careful reading might suggest that when you see repeated motifs like divine descent, councils, cosmic order, or catastrophic flooding, it is tempting to treat them as literal reports. But myths often repeat because they are useful symbols. They help societies talk about power, fear, and renewal in a way that can be retold across generations. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that repetition indicates cultural importance more than literal reportage. Still, the escape lens can be explored as gentle imagination without crossing into certainty. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can picture the ancient texts as layered voices. Some lines are clearly administrative and grounded. Some lines are poetic and symbolic. Some lines are ambiguous enough to invite debate. And in that ambiguity, modern minds hear footsteps that may not be there, not because they are foolish, but because the human mind likes mystery the way the body likes warmth. To keep things honest, you remind yourself of the truth ladder. Some parts are documented, like the existence of scribes, temples, trade networks, and the presence of myths with divine councils and cosmic order language. Some parts are interpretation, like how specific terms should be mapped across contexts or what social experiences a myth might echo. And some parts are gentle imagination, like picturing escape, not as a literal event, but as a mood, a narrative shape, a possibility that can illuminate how stories feel. Third light joke arrives soft and sleepy. You imagine a modern person time travelling into the city, demanding to meet the Anunnaki, and a tired administrator handing them a clay tablet that says, "Please take a number." The traveller is confused. The administrator is not. Civilization, after all, has priorities. Most historians agree that the safest way to approach big claims is to ask what the evidence can actually support. The evidence we do have points to a world of human institutions, symbolic myths, and evolving traditions. Archaeology suggests that when we cannot confirm something, we should say so. That is not a buzzkill. It is respect for the past. And yet, you do not banish wonder. Wonder is part of why the night feels gentle. You can hold wonder without turning it into certainty. You can let a theory remain a theory. You can follow clues without announcing a verdict. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And in a sleep-friendly story that is not frustrating, it is soothing. It means the past can stay spacious, with room for calm questions that do not demand an answer before you rest. You keep walking until the streets feel almost emptied of purpose, like the city has finished its errands and is now only breathing. A lamp burns low in a doorway. The air smells faintly of cooled ash and damp clay, and every so often you catch that familiar whisper of reed and water carried on the breeze, even this far from the canal. Somewhere a night bird calls once, then goes quiet, as if it remembers. This is a place where silence is valuable. Most historians agree that Sumer's legacy survives in fragments, tablets, ruins, seal impressions, and the long echo of ideas that later cultures adopted and reshaped. Archaeology suggests that early Mesopotamian cities built durable systems for administration, worship, and trade, and the evidence we do have points to humans solving practical problems with startling creativity, counting, recording, standardizing, organizing. You can feel it in the very way the city is arranged. It is not just a place to live. It is a place designed to keep living even when life gets complicated. One interpretation is that the most powerful technology here is not a tool in the hand, but a pattern in the mind. A careful reading might suggest that writing, sealing, schooling, temple distribution, and river transport form a single web of coordination. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it raises the possibility that what later people called divine order might be in part human systems working well enough to feel larger than any one person. When things run smoothly, it feels like the cosmos approves. Historians still argue whether mythic language about gods descending and withdrawing should be treated mainly as ritual symbolism, political theology, cultural memory of stress, or a layered mixture that changes with time and context. There's no full consensus, and that is exactly why tonight's theme can remain both grounded and open. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist one last time. On solid ground, the Anunnaki are part of a complex religious world, a divine grouping whose meanings shift across texts and eras. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths are not straightforward historical transcripts, and the evidence we do have points to symbolic storytelling used to explain authority, disorder, and renewal. Archaeology suggests that the institutions behind the stories are real, and human temples, scribes, workshops, ports, farms, and the daily grind of keeping a city fed. Now the misty portion arrives carefully labelled so it stays safe. A fringe idea proposes that ancient records hint the Anunnaki did not arrive as conquerors but escaped as survivors, leaving coded traces in administration myths and imagery. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for literal non-human escapees is thin. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a gentle lens rather than a claim. It asks you to notice how often the machinery of civilization, the very tools of order, could also serve as tools of quiet departure if anyone ever needed to leave without making noise. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not saying we found a hidden confession in clay. We are saying the shape of the evidence can support multiple moods. The documented mood is a story of human ingenuity. The interpretive mood is a story of institutions' legitimacy and how symbols reflect lived experience. The imagined mood is a soft cinematic question. What if some of the language that sounds like arrival could also be heard as leaving if you listen for withdrawal distance and the hush of administrative routine? Your first light joke arrives as you picture someone trying to pin all this to a single answer. You think with sleepy amusement that if ancient Mesopotamia could send you a message, it would be a clay tablet that says, "Please, stop asking for one simple explanation." Then it would stamp it with an official seal and file it forever. Most historians agree that the safest way to approach big mysteries is to accept complexity. The evidence we do have points to cities that adapt stories that evolve, and people who keep building even when the ground shifts beneath them. Archaeology suggests that continuity is real, but so is change. The past is not one clean line, it is a braided rope. Second light joke slips in as you imagine a scribe listening to modern debates about what his tablet really means. You picture him blinking slowly and saying it means 10 sheep, and then walking away because he has deadlines and the temple storeroom is not going to audit itself. And still you do not throw away the mist. You let it sit at the edge of the lamplight. If the escape lens helps someone feel the past as alive and strange, it can be used carefully with honest disclaimers. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. Your third light joke arrives soft as a pillow. You imagine the Anunnaki, however you picture them, filling out an exit form, and the form has a box that says, "Reason for leaving." The options are flood politics, budget cuts and other, and they tick other, because even cosmic beings apparently hate paperwork. Now you let your pace slow and you let the language slow with it, because it is time to drift down, not to reach, not to solve, just to settle. The city around you becomes a quieter shape, a collection of warm walls cooling under the stars, a few lamps holding their tiny circles of light, a few footsteps fading into sleep. You can almost hear the reed stylus again, not urgent, just steady tap and press, as if the world is being gently written into existence, one small mark at a time. Most historians agree that what survives from Sumer is partial but precious, and the evidence we do have points to real people living real days, making bread, mending walls, counting grain, telling stories, watching the sky, Archaeology suggests that the past is often ordinary and that the ordinary is exactly what lasts. And it's possible if you let yourself rest in the possibility that the grandest mysteries are not hidden behind secret doors at all. They are hidden in plain sight inside the daily routines that keep a city alive. A careful reading might suggest that even if no dramatic escape ever happened, the feeling of departure is still part of human history. Leaders leave, certainty leaves, seasons change, rivers shift, and people keep going, carrying their systems, their stories, their quiet courage. So you let the last image soften. Not a single answer, not a final reveal, just a night city breathing, and a river moving somewhere beyond the walls, and a lamp that refuses to hurry. You breathe in slowly, you breathe out more slowly. The tablets remain sleeping in the dark, holding their wedges of meaning. Without insisting, you choose only one. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And tonight, that is enough. Your shoulders loosen, your jaw unclenches. The lamp light in your mind dims to a gentle glow, and the city, so old and so patient, becomes a quiet background hum like a fan in the corner of your room, steady and safe as you drift toward sleep.